When analyzing something intended to be scary, one can often fall into the trap of assuming that horror is explicitly designed to be scary. At surface level, every aspect of it is repulsive to us, luring us deeper into its web. Hi, my name is Jack, and for about a year now, I've been wondering what is it about Robert Eggers' Nosferatu that invokes the question of horror? And what exactly is it about horror that induces us into fascination? Upon first seeing the 2024 remake, I was enamored with how a modern horror film could be so beautiful. It was only directly after the showing that I began to think to myself, wait a minute, wasn't this the birth of horror? Isn't it supposed to be scary? Robert Eggers has never been the kind of director who sticks to the norm. He creates his own cinematic coding and should be praised for that. It's not easy to break from Hollywood normality in a modern world. For some, it was The Lighthouse, as a critically and publicly praised work of horror art that put his name on the map. For me, it was The Northman, with its esoteric, almost drug induced fantasies of Viking myth which enticed me into its dreamlike narrative. Despite his tendency to name his movies The Something, he never disappoints at bringing new flavors to the table when it comes to his directing arsenal. This is why, at first, Nosferatu can seem puzzling. Why just Nosferatu? His original works, albeit inspired by a variety of tales and existing media, were always just that, original. So what was the benefit of fielding a remake? Before we break down Eggers' vision, let's take a quick look at the horror classic that defined the genre. Firstly, what is coding? To keep it simple, coding in film is the predefined social traits that we place upon genres, the established norms of movies. For example, superheroes wearing capes, or a bad guy eating an apple just so he looks a little bit more evil. A lot of focus in Nosferatu is about the coding behind the traditional damsel in distress trope, which we'll touch on later. Despite the original film's current acclaim, I very much doubt that many of the people who went to see the remake have ever seen the original. It is, after all, a silent movie and proudly sits at 103 years old as of today. Not to shame any of those people, unless you're a movie fanatic, it's not an easy watch, but it is a fascinating one. For some, Nosferatu is considered the birth of the horror genre as we know it. Its production under the unique ideology of the German Expressionist film movement meant that it is a subtly beautiful story heavily entrenched in societal and political struggles of that time. A key feature of German Expressionism was its abstract use of dreamlike fantasies and almost feverish sequences of narrative storytelling used to encompass real struggles and real societal problems. Sound familiar in any way? It is of no doubt to me that Robert Eggers was massively inspired by this style of filmmaking. Likewise, the trend of adapting horror literature to the modern medium through film. As renowned literary horror scholar Yvonne Leffler expounds in her book Horror as Pleasure, terror and horror that is disguised in both reality and the unreal is an inarguably powerful tool when it comes to enticing interest in the horror genre. It is precisely this quality that makes the work of Eggers so tantalizing to watch. The classical horror coding in the allure of the unnatural and inexplicable, mixed with modern anxieties in an ever-advancing societal and political climate, creates such a volatile environment for storytelling. The goal is never to explicitly scare, because, as we all know, there is no imagery of fear or terror greater than the imaginary fears we ourselves create. Now, we have the groundwork laid out. Let's take a closer look at traditional horror coding and break down the Nosferatu to see if we can find what makes it effective in a modern context. Firstly, let's identify a clear protagonist. What is a protagonist? Well, according to Wikipedia, a protagonist is the main character of a story, whose actions affect the plot and work to propel the narrative forward. Likewise, they must overcome adversity to achieve their goal. In that case, it can't be Thomas. Everything he does is predetermined and presented by other characters. It can't be Ellen. The plot mostly affects her negatively as it's pushed by others around her, so it wouldn't make sense to place her in the protagonist's shoes. It definitely isn't Willem Dafoe's character. He's mostly just insane, and only appears after a great portion of the story has already happened.
Is it Count Orlok? His actions directly progress the plot, he has a vested interest in resolving the conflicts, and he has a clearly defined goal for us to root for, and in the meantime overcomes great societal adversity to achieve it.
Okay, let's ignore that for now. He is the bad guy, after all. Let's move on to the antagonist. That'll be a lot easier. An antagonist, according to Wikipedia, is a character in the story who is presented as a villain, a rival to the protagonist who often makes moral choices that are less than savory in order to create conflict. More often than not, an antagonist will be somewhat of an equal to the protagonist in order to create an enjoyable narrative conflict, much like every Marvel hero has a direct counterpart with the same kind of abilities. This could be a little bit more difficult to define, but given that we, as of right now, have a protagonist, it shouldn't be too hard to find. It's not Thomas. Again, he just reacts to the plot and holds no influence over his own decisions.
It can't be Ellen, because she has always been influenced by Orlok, like when she first reaches out and pulls him in, putting him under a dark hex of infatuation and lust, sending him into a controlled craze of demonic possessiveness that she seems to be able to hold power over.
Wait, hold on. As far as the narrative goes to present us these two main characters, there is no definable way of determining who the protagonist and who the antagonist is. They just are. It's not necessarily a groundbreaking approach, but it puts the film into a bit of a different perspective when you stop trying to understand Orlok as this scary horror antagonist and try observing him with some sort of sympathy. The exact opposite also functions for the character of Ellen. If you stop observing her as a classical coded horror damsel in distress who must be saved and protected by the forces of good, certain aspects of her character begin to break down to reveal an equally, if not even more terrifying, dark presence inside of her. It is, after all, always in the presence of her that innocent characters meet their torturous demise, as if the darkness itself becomes her. She has Orlok under her spell from the very start of the film. Every decision he makes is perpetually made under her supervision, to the effort of getting closer to her, not for revenge or power, but for love. Yes, it is stated in the film that Orlok might believe that he will regain his lost strength by draining her blood, but this is never proven as factual, and in the end, the exact opposite turns out to be true. The demon that lives inside of Ellen dragged Orlok across land and sea just to have him die in a bout of his own consumption, fueled by lust, a metaphor that we were perhaps meant to find. The traditional coding of horror leaves us as an audience under the assumption that Ellen can only be the damsel in distress, and therefore Orlok must be the villain. It is these codes that Eggers actively tries to push against. He isn't trying to subvert audience expectations, which is a common point of contention amongst modern filmgoers. He is utilizing the original values of historical horror to subvert the expectations of the established coding itself. Both versions are totally viewable by the public. Orlok can be both villain and protagonist depending on how you choose to interpret the film, which I think is kind of fascinating. All this effort of subverting expectations and the creation of such interesting and unique characters, for what exactly? How does all of this tie into the conventions of German Expressionism that we talked about, that we determine Eggers was so inspired by? Well, as each film is up to the individual viewer's interpretation, beauty being in the eye of the beholder, I can only really speak for how I view it, so I'll do my best. Given that we know how the German Expressionist movement paved the way for anchoring key cultural issues within fictional narratives to amplify the audience experience and engagement, I think it's important to go in with open-minded ideas and be comfortable with the idea that Nosferatu plans on questioning our understanding of current cultural problematics. With this in mind, I think focusing on the standout narrative moments that signify key moments of conflict surrounding our main characters will help us in identifying what kind of underlying meaning the film rests itself upon. If we look closer at the beginning of the movie, Ellen's initial action where she reaches out into the void and comes into contact with Orlok in the first place, we are shown this moment as the inciting incident, the moment that the plot is kicked into motion. At this point in the movie, we as an audience rest on our laurels in that Ellen is clearly the damsel in distress and is under the control of Orlok. Yet, upon understanding the coding deeper, and having seen the rest of the movie, we can analyze this moment much more broadly. It is in this moment that we are introduced to the thing that plagues Ellen the most: loneliness. It is in the dark of the night that her fear of simply being alone takes hold of her and pushes her deeper and deeper into a well of despair. It is perhaps here that the more demonic side of her is first manifested. Upon understanding the later acts of the movie, we learn that it is her connection to her loneliness that gives her the supernatural powers that come to force the entire plot into motion.
Her lack of control and her subservience to the empty void is exactly what Orlok latches onto in this opening scene, or indeed what latches onto him. Not in the name of terror or fear, but of love.
Love is exactly what they both seek. It is simply an act of connection amongst two lonely stars. Loneliness and mental health in this context become closely interlinked, as when paired, they negatively act upon each other. It is, I think, within this understanding that it is impossible not to see allegory in reference to our modern society. It is no secret that we as a people are feeling more and more alone with every passing year. This despite our ever-increasing connectivity with each other and with our culture. We are terminally plugged in to an impossible void of empty emotions and loneliness, many of us failing to find intimate connections despite it being supposedly easier than ever.
The negative effects of loneliness on mental health ever pushing us deeper and deeper into a hole of interconnected antisocial tendencies. Younger people specifically are more and more affected by this epidemic. Some parts of Europe reporting that an average of 15% of young people feel lonely most of the time. As increasing parts of our lives become beholden to an online space, social structures fall more and more to the wayside.
With this in mind, I feel as though the film makes great effort to portray a meaningful representation of loneliness and the effect it can have on an ailed mind such as Ellen's. And the allegory can in fact be taken even deeper. As stated, the main crux of the inciting incident is that Ellen is blinded by her desires to find love and companionship, and through her abilities ensnares and causes the Nosferatu to become infatuated with her, coaxing him into requiring her in order to live. In this moment, our main characters become characters of fate. Their lives and desires become linked irreversibly. This to represent the problematic state of love and relationships that plague our modern society. The void into which the protagonists reach, becoming a clear representation of the internet, and the cacophony of dating apps specifically designed to be demonic and to hinder connection as much as possible for the purpose of user retention. That the movie portrays these issues directly as plague, suffering, and demonic consumption is not accidental. The tragedy of Ellen and Orlok, as it perhaps could be known, resembles more of a Shakespearean-esque story of doomed love, destined to fail but destiny nonetheless. Ellen is unable to control her demons, so must sacrifice herself in order to save what remains of that which she loves from both herself and the Count. And in order for Orlok to succeed in his protagonist narrative arc, he must, as is coded in the film, get the girl of his dreams despite all adversity, even through death. The final macabre image of destined lovers, intertwined and connected even in their final moments, tragically representing the impossibility of finding true love and connection in a world plagued by emptiness. It is the simplistic nature of this remake that bewildered everything that I know about classical horror tradition. It doesn't just make a mockery of that which came before by reproducing it through the modern, sloppy pipeline. It is a love letter to the original masterpiece that went on to define a genre.
It also stands triumphant as proof that the coding that was so core to the understanding of what we would consider as ancient film relics still holds up today, 100 years later, in the court of modernity. Not just as a representation of what can be done by film, but as a question to the genre itself. Is horror, so simplistically put, only supposed to be scary?